more detail. But here is the table of content. We're going to, again, talk about the history. We're going to get kind of into the fundamentals. And then we're going to start talking about really the evolution of SEO and what Google is doing. You're going to hear me reference Google almost exclusively, and it's simply because they are the 800-pound gorilla in search. They control the vast majority of the market share, have for the last 15 years, and continue to gain grounds in that space. All right, where do we come from? So it's interesting with search is that it's become more centralized. Back in the early days of, around 2000, 1998, these were search engines that existed, that people interacted with and used. Most of them don't exist anymore. They were either acquired and folded into a larger company, or they simply were not sustainable businesses. But before that, before Google, you essentially had directories, which were human edited. So human beings were actually going in and ranking sites based on certain criteria. And then obviously Google ended up developing a much better approach to this, which is through automation and building a true search engine based on certain signals. And we'll talk about originally what Google's intent was and then how it's kind of evolved from there. And so a brief history, 90% of all searches in 2021 occurred on a Google product. So you've got Google Images, YouTube, which is owned by Google, Google Maps. So when you combine all those products together, they absolutely dominate the search landscape. And then I'm not going to go through the specifics of each of these updates, but I'm going to touch on the more impactful ones. Google is notorious for having cute names for their algorithm updates to make everybody feel warm and fuzzy, which it generally does not do. So Panda, the first one we're going to start talking about in 2011, was really focused on over-optimized sites. So people would take keywords, stuff them into all elements of the website, whether it's page titles and meta tag descriptions, which is what Google's using to make up the snippets on the results page. They would just repeat keywords over and over. Google realized really early on that was causing a bad user experience. It was essentially gaming the system, which goes against what Google wants to have happening, obviously. The next rollout was Penguin in 2012, which was more about backlinks profile. So backlinking we're going to talk about because it's really, really important. It continues to be the foundation of what Google does. The best example I can give is the term paper analogy. So when you were in school and you were writing a research paper and a term paper, turned it into the teacher, the one that had the works cited page that was fully fleshed out with tons of citations was immediately viewed as more credible than the one that had one citation. So Google's looking at backlinks, and that's simply websites that are linking to your website. They're looking long and hard at what that profile looks like, and what they're specifically looking for are quality, relevant, topically relevant, trustworthy links that are linking to your site. And so this was a big cleanup of that, because what had happened was people were at a race to volume. So it was all about quantity over quality. How many backlinks can I go source to my website? Google realized, again, that was problematic for them. So they started to clamp down and really get publishers and websites to focus on that relevance piece of the equation. And then from there, I'm going to skip over Hummingbird, but we'll talk about mobile first and RankBrain. So this is really when Google started to transform the way that they were operating in 2015, putting mobile first as a priority. I think the rise of mobile caught everyone, including Google, off guard. The adoption happened much, much quicker than they, I think, had planned for. But it was a successful rollout, and now mobile first is what they're looking at when they're looking at a website, which can be a little bit hard to wrap your head around because sites now are responsive, so you really don't have a mobile site versus a desktop website. You just have a website that adjusts its scale to different size browsers. And then RankBrain was a really important one. This is getting more into the nuances of language. So Google's machine learning is starting to understand the relationships of words. So it's not just about a specific keyword query. It's about a long tail query because people are asking Google entire questions, and how do all of those words within a sentence or question relate to one another. And then the March update was also a big one, and it's one that's the most probably overlooked, and I would argue the most impactful, and one you can control the easiest, which is engagement metrics. So Google started looking at things like click-through rates. How many people were clicking through on your listing on Google when it was coming back? They're looking at dwell time. How long were you staying on that site? Pages per visit, time on page. All of those they considered to be signals that a site either was providing value to the user or it was not. And so that was a big push. And then BERT in 2019, which stands for Bidirectional Encoder Representation for Transformers. And again, this is all about machine learning is what Google's hyper-focused on, and understanding, again, how words, whenever they're typed into a query, relate to each other and context of those words. So if you're talking about kings, are you talking about royalty or are you talking about a sports team? And how the other words within that query would give Google insight into that. And then the big one this past year, which is Core Vitals. So Google is hyper-focused now on performance. If you look at it from Google's perspective, sites that are slow loading, that are bulky, it's a resource management issue for Google. At the end of the day, they are a utility to some degree, and they have to manage resources. And so they're looking at, we'll talk about some of the metrics related to the Core Vitals and the tests that you can run to look at your website currently and see how it's performing. I will say that their recommendations around core vital metrics are really hard to achieve, and you have to take it with a grain of salt. But if you do a page speed test and it comes back at 12, that's problematic. If you do a page speed test that comes back at 50, that wouldn't set off necessarily alarms for me. So just keep that in mind. And then let's talk a little bit about the fundamentals. So core vitals we just talked about, and we'll look at all these metrics a little bit more on another slide. But largest contentful paint, first input delay, and then cumulative layout shift. So cumulative layout shift is how quickly can I interact with the site on my phone is what they're looking at. Largest contentful paint is how quickly the site is loading fully onto a device. Those are the two primary metrics I would look at. We'll talk about what first input delay means a little bit more, but I would say from experience, the contentful paint metric and then the cumulative layout shift metric are far more important. And so on-page optimization, you all are likely familiar with these concepts, but page titles and meta tag descriptions make up the snippet that's coming back in Google. If you don't put these elements in your website, Google will create them for you, and you have lost control to some degree of your marketing message. So making sure, at least on the core pages of your website, that these elements are fully filled out. And the key here is we're not writing for search engines. I tell people all this all the time. Even though you're not paying when somebody clicks on this, I have to compel a human being to click on that at the end of the day. And so I would look at these almost like you're writing an ad, with the page title being the headline and then the meta tag description, which is the smaller font text below it, being kind of the sub headline or supporting text. You don't want to get overly, you got to walk the line between very literal language, because search engines are literal, and steering away from real flowery marketing speak. You can do that more in true ads that you're paying for. So these elements are really important for Google to understand what the intent of a page is. It's one of the first things that Googlebot is crawling to understand what a particular site or a page within that site is about. And then we talk about, whether it's a product content or features and benefits content on your website. All of that, I think it was Bill Gates that coined content is king back in the late 80s, and it still applies. And people are like, well, what exactly does that mean? And it means providing useful information to your user base and answering questions. And we'll talk about how that ties into the passage panel and knowledge panel, which is another part of Google's search results that we're seeing more and more of these days. And then more on-site optimization is blog content. That is really designed to be features and benefit focused around your particular product. And image optimization, so both alt text and file names. So it doesn't make sense to do this retroactively, but as you're adding new image files to your site, save the image file in a naming convention that makes sense, because the bots will crawl that image, that directory or the structure of it to understand what the image is. Google has developed tech now that AI can detect what an image is, but it's not quite ready for prime time. So these two elements, both the file name and alt text as it relates to images, helps tell Google what that image is. And then video optimization. So one recommendation I make is whether you turn on closed caption or not, always upload a transcript for a YouTube video. And you can find resources on sites like Fiverr that'll take your video and turn it into a simple Word document that you'll then upload along with your video as well, because the Googlebot will crawl that transcript as well to understand more about what the content of the video is. And then we switch to off-page optimization. This is where it gets labor intensive, and there is no easy answers to this. But as far as a content strategy, this is where we're developing more long-form content that is broader in nature. It's not so feature and benefit focused around your product. It's more about the industry and the world that you kind of live in. Because what we want to do is take that long-form content. You're not publishing it on your website. We're engaging in outreach, which you can view as kind of like digital PR, where we're reaching out to publishers. And some of those, to be quite honest, could be bloggers that have a high domain authority in Google's eyes. All that is a numerical score of 1 to 100 that Google assigns to a domain based on how trustworthy and authoritative they think it is. So you really want to develop that content strategy and then have an outreach strategy so that you're identifying websites and publishers that you want to offer the content to, with the idea that they're going to publish it on their website, and then there's backlinks in that content coming to your website. And that is a labor-intensive process. There is no easy way to do it. There are some tools to help guide that process, but it's a matter of carving out, I think, or having a team member carve out an hour a day and having a list that they can do manual outreach. And then, you know, how those messages, because what you're really engaging in is an unpaid sales. You're trying to sell somebody something, which is this free content. So those outreach messages, we use a platform like Pitchbox, where it will give you analytics back on those emails that are going out to people, so that you could kind of tweak and craft the message so that your open rates and then their willingness to accept the content and publish it, that likelihood increases. And then technical SEO is a big part of it. The core vitals that we talked about earlier ties into this, but technical SEO can also be around minifying code, looking in a code base and making sure that it's as lean and running as lean and mean as possible. And then the server-side optimization. This is something that you're going to run into more with large e-commerce sites that are running, you know, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of SKUs. They have a tendency to get bogged down, and so the server, once you've looked at the website, the code itself, all the core vitals, it's still not running. It's likely a server environment issue that you need to take a look at. And then, so RankBrain, we talked a little bit about this earlier. It's Google's push towards machine learning and eventually towards AI, so that they're understanding queries not only on a more granular level, but they're doing it at the speed of light. So when I first started doing this, if you uploaded a new piece of content to a website, it could take up to 30, even 60 days for Google to crawl that. If you upload a new page today, it'll be crawled within a couple of days. That's how quickly Google's moving these days. So we won't get into the weeds around RankBrain, but just know that its core intent is a push towards machine learning and letting that power how they're ranking sites in the search results. Core vitals we talked about a little bit. So that first metric, LCP, is the largest contentful paint. That's simply loading. They say they want it less than 2.5 seconds. Again, I'll tell you from experience, it's very, very hard to do. So I would say anything less than 4 seconds is a success. If you start to get around the 6 to 8 second time, statistically, the data's there to show it, is that people will bounce. And that number is shrinking every year as people's behavior continues to evolve and humans continue to be impatient. They just simply won't wait. So they'll hit the dreaded back button on their browser, which is what we don't want to have happening. So page speed, if you search for Google Core Vitals in Google, a tool will come back, you put your URL in, hit submit, and it's going to kick back not only the performance as it relates to these metrics, but recommendations specifically that you need to do to address these metrics from Google's perspective. They also do, in addition to paid speed, they're looking at accessibility how easy it is to interact with a particular website, the usability of it, very closely related to accessibility, and then security. So if your site's not on an SSL, I highly recommend that you do that. So Google, even if you're not an e-commerce site, it's best to have a SSL, which just turns from HTTP to HTTPS. You'll see in the top of the browser window. And then here's the engagement metrics I was referring to earlier. This gets a little bit deeper, but average visit duration, visits per unique visitor, average pages per visit, conversion rate, bounce rate, monthly visits. These are all metrics that you're probably likely familiar with, and I can assure you that Google is very familiar with them, and they're looking very closely at all these metrics as it relates to a website to determine how valuable it is to their users. And then this is really, Google's kind of focus. This has become their mantra as of late, and EAT, you'll hear referenced a lot as it relates to SEO, and it's all about expertise, authority, and trust. And so I was saying that you want to partner and reach out with websites, bloggers, publishers in your space. This needs to be a consideration. So if you go and look, and we'll talk about some of the insight tools that will allow you to do this, but if you look at their backlink profile and it's really spammy, meaning that they have 20,000 backlinks coming from only 10 different sites, that's probably somebody you want to steer away with. They're engaging in really spammy kind of practices that Google tends to frown upon. But this is really important to consider this overall concept, both as it relates to your on-site content, but also websites that you're going to pitch more long-form content to as well. We're not going to talk a whole lot about this either. It is related to RankBrain, but what it's doing is looking, it is a machine learning concept, but what it's doing is looking at all the elements of Google's search product. So whenever somebody makes a particular query, there may be a video that's more applicable to their query than a web page. There may be an image or a infographic that's more applicable. So this MUM, the multitask uniform model, is allowing Google to understand what is the right asset to pull back based on that user's query so that we're giving them the best information that we possibly can. And then, so it's all about digital asset optimization. So people get hyper-focused a lot on their website, which makes sense. But there's other areas on Google search results page. There's images, there's video. You see the tabs at the top. And it's called universal or blended search. And what Google's starting to do is pull in all elements based on the query, all different elements, and dropping them on the results page. So in the years past, you would just see a results page of a bunch of lists of websites. And if you've done a Google search lately, you'll see that it's become much more than that. So user experience and user intent, we covered this a bit, that page speed, and looking at those metrics is going to be really critical. And then handing those recommendations off to your developers. And a lot of them are going to roll their eyes and go, oh my God, what are you doing to me? And just let them know that these are recommendations from Google and that we understand that all this may not be achievable or might not even make sense in all instances for some sites. Security we talked about, it's become very important for Google and something that your hosting provider can handle for you. Generally, you can do it with the click of a button as far as adding an SSL certificate to your website. And then understanding your user's intent. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more as well. But somebody searching for Lotus Evora, just so everybody knows, that's my dream car. That's why I use it as an example. Is a very different user, a different intent than somebody looking for a used Lotus Evora S for sale. The second example is an example of what you'll hear referred to as long tail queries. I am a big fan of long tail queries, particularly for startups. And the reason is this. If somebody is looking for that kind of a query, use Lotus Evora for sale, the search volume on that query is going to be a fraction of the query above it. But this person is further down the funnel and they know exactly what they're looking for. So when you look at long tail queries, they may not have a ton of search volume, but when you aggregate them all together, it does translate to good search volume. And more importantly, it's people further down the funnel that are making very specific queries, and they know what they want at that stage. And then schema-based structured data. This is another one that I see that often gets overlooked. For e-commerce sites, it's really critical because you want your star reviews, if you have good ones, assuming, to show on the search results page when it comes back. And we use what's called schema-based structured data to do that. This is nothing that the user would ever see. This is all code on the back end of your website that is structuring these elements so that if you run a wedding venue, for example, all of your upcoming events would populate below that organic listing in Google. If you have certain products, it may show some product samples along with the price as well. If you're in a space that revolves around food and foodies, you may have recipes that will populate below the actual search result. So it's a really effective way to increase your click-through rates, particularly with those star ratings. People put a lot of weight on those reviews, and so whenever you can have your listing in Google, organic listing appended with those star reviews, it's definitely something you want to look at doing. Implementation of this is pretty straightforward. I wouldn't really consider it a developer task, though they likely could knock it out much faster than I could. But I have implemented structured data before on websites, and it's a pretty straightforward process. Schema.org is a website that talks about all of this in much more detail and can make more specific recommendations around how to leverage it. All right. And then we talked about this a little bit more. So in the days of old, you would make a query in Google, and the results would come back, and it would just be a list of page titles and meta tag descriptions from different websites. Now Google is starting to fold in these new features, featured snippets, and then passage rankings. So what these are both intended to do, in short, is to answer specific questions. Whether it's a how-to related question, Google will take that query, match it to a particular passage on a website. So it's really important on your website, particularly on frequently asked questions sections, that you're asking questions that you know that your customers frequently come to you with. Because what Google's going to do is that, this is a good example. What is a featured snippet? They're going and pulling from Beaufort Digital, which is an agency, and then they're pulling also from Google Support to answer that specific question that somebody has put into Google as a query. And then long form content and AI. This is where it gets interesting. So I've experimented with these tools. I will tell you that they're not, from a content perspective, they're not quite ready for prime time from my perspective. So Pattern 89 is one tool that I've used for writing ad copy. It did okay. There was never a measurable result to show that it outperformed a human writing copy, but it did a decent job. Where you get into some challenging areas with these kind of tools is more long form technical writing. So this machine that you see here, Apex 7, is a client I worked with called Zeal that works in both the cannabis and hemp space. That machine removes pathogens, microbials, mold from your crop. If you happen to have that kind of infestation, it goes through this machine like at an airport, and it comes out on the other end clean and ready to go. Very, very technical machine. We tried to write a content piece about this with the assistance of Jarvis, which is an AI platform, and it came back a jumbled up mess that didn't really make sense. The AI just could not understand the full context of the product and all the features and benefits and how they related to each other. So it came back as you could barely make sense of it. So I think that there's a future for AI, there certainly is in broad terms, but more specifically as it relates to content generation and creation. But I think that it's got probably another 2 to 3 years to go before we see it a little bit more fleshed out. And Google Discover is another one to think about. There's not anything tactically that you can really do here other than, again, generating great content, but it's another aggregator tool which, based on your past behaviors, and if you have a Gmail address and you're logged in, Google knows a lot about your past behaviors. And so just like Facebook pushes content to you based on things that you've engaged with and visited in the past, Google's looking at your entire search history. They're looking at websites that you've visited, and then they're aggregating all the things that, based on what they know about your behavior, that you're going to be interested in. So, my home screen on my phone, I'm an Android user, is currently Google Discover. It's a product that's gone through a couple of iterations. I think Google Now was their delving into social. It was kind of their answer to Facebook, and it failed pretty miserably, so they rebranded it as Google Discover, and I think it's probably a better approach for what they do. And then, so key takeaways, site speed, performance, usability are critical. As far as usability goes, so there's some great tools like Hotjar that will show you how a user is moving through your website with heat maps. You can see kind of that user journey. I'm also a big proponent of actual user testing. So there's a platform called usertesting.com. I had a situation a couple of years ago where I had a client that had redone their search feature on their website. Their demographic was 35 to 45-year-old male truck owners, not high school diploma, no college education. And they had over-engineered this search feature to the point that, as a pretty experienced technologist, I didn't even know what to do. So I kept telling them that this is the reason that we're running into problems, is that based on your demographic profile of who you're targeting, you've over-engineered this and it doesn't make sense. And they kept pushing back and kept pushing back. So I went to usertesting.com, found 4 subjects in their demographic, truck owners 35 to 45, wrote a scenario for them and watched all 5 of them run into the exact same problem. And then had that video to share with the client to say, this is why we need to revisit what we've done with the search filtering and the feature that you built. And so we talked about site speed and performance, on-page optimization, which I think is, I think there's this tendency to get kind of hyper-focused just on your website. But again, look at it a little bit in broader terms of not just the website itself, but all the elements that tie into that website. So some of you probably have YouTube videos embedded in your website, right? And we want to give Google every opportunity possible to understand the context of that video, where it's applicable, and to pull it back in the search results so that we can try to inform and grab that potential customer. For e-commerce websites, if anybody works exclusively in e-commerce or know anybody that does, from an on-page optimization standpoint, you have to prioritize because e-commerce sites tend to have a lot of product pages. Publishers, when you're engaging in outreach in e-commerce, are really hesitant to link to a product page. It's just the focus is too narrow. So your on-page optimization efforts should really start at the collection pages and make sure that those are all really well optimized for SEO. Then, if you're going to switch to the product pages, you got to kind of look at the 80-20 rule or 20-80 rule, that 20% of your SKUs are probably making up 80% of your revenue, and then prioritize based on that. Again, as far as content goes, blog topics tend to be shorter form, 750 to 1,000 words. On site, they would live on your blog and be really focused around the product itself and the features and benefits of the product. And then long form editorial content we talked about earlier, really working with a content writer who can go and do some topic research and see what kind of content these publishers have accepted historically. And then be able to frame your content strategy a little bit around that so that when you're pitching to these publishers or bloggers, I don't want to forget about bloggers because surprisingly, there are bloggers, particularly in the food space and the tech space and the financial space, that have a very high domain authority, meaning that Google views them as very authoritative and trustworthy. And then engagement metrics. So looking into Google Analytics, you want to be mindful of what all these metrics are. There's plenty of resources that will give you benchmarks around vertical kind of specific, what a typical click-through rate looks like, what typical dwell time on site is, pages per visit, all of those, so that you can see if you're seeing any kind of alarming trends. Bounce rate is one that can be a little bit tricky for people. Sometimes a page is intended to have a high bounce rate. Generally, your website is not. A bounce rate is simply the percentage of people that have hit a website and taken no other action except hit the back button. And that means that you've lost that person. A typical bounce rate is surprisingly around 50%. So if you log into your analytics and you see your bounce rate is 50 to 60%, don't be alarmed. That's not unusual at all. But it's one of those things that if you have a specific landing page that has a specific intent, people are either going to engage with that page or they're going to bounce. So that's an outlier, an instance where you would kind of expect to see a higher bounce rate. And then resources. So these are some good ones. This first one I share with everybody I work with, from Fortune 500 clients down to kind of mom and pop operations. This is Google's this is their document. They publish this and they update it 3 or 4 times a year. So they're very transparent around what they're looking for. People think there's a lot of voodoo and magic going on behind the scenes. Google's very upfront about what they want website operators to be doing. So please reference that. It used to be a PDF. They've now converted it to HTML with a table of contents. So you can kind of skip around areas if you're more familiar with one concept, not so much with another. It makes that navigation moving around really easy. A book I highly recommend. It is old. I think it was published in 2012, but it's still a really interesting read around what Google's ultimate mission is. So the title's The Big Switch: Rewiring the World from Edison to Google. And it really talks about Google more as a utility than just a website, and how it's become, we used to, I'm sure some of you can relate, when I was a kid, if you needed to find something, you would pick up the yellow pages and pour through it. That was the utility, and now nobody does that. I mean, I can't remember the last time I looked in a phone book. It just doesn't happen anymore. So that's a great book to read. These sites focus specifically around SEO. Search Engine Land is a great site. Moz is not just a great site for content, but they've got some really good tools that you can use as well that are free when you're doing things like keyword research, looking at a competitor's backlink profile. Sites like SEMrush and Moz are really good at providing some of those insights for you. Search Engine Journal is another big one that I highly recommend. And then as far as industry experts, I would put Bruce Clay and then a guy named Neil Patel are probably kind of the forefront leaders in this industry. So if you want to follow somebody, whether on social media or his website, he produces a lot of great content as well. Really sharp guy that has a lot of good insights. And then SEMrush, I mentioned, is a great SEO tool. So looking at, I want to go pitch my content to publishers. Well, where do I start? Well, the first thing I would do is go to SEMrush, put in that competitor's URL. We could see their backlink profile and see everyone that's linking to them, and then go pitch similar content to those publishers to try to replicate some of those backlinks. Okay, and I think that is it, you guys. I wanted to leave some time for question and answer, which we're kind of at that stage, so please feel free to fire away. If you don't have questions, that's fine too. Yes?
So for someone who's looking for one person, if there's a button at the bottom of that, just click it. Yep. Thank you. Sure. So for someone who may be just a one-person shop, really just getting started, maybe they've got a website, maybe they've got a social media account, where should they focus, like their first sort of outing into trying to be more SEO conscious?
So, yeah. So understanding the keyword queries that your potential customers are making. There's tools like Uber Suggest, which actually is owned by Neil Patel. So understanding who your customers are and what are they searching for, those queries, and at least for startups or early stage companies, steering away from those head terms. So if I sell men's brown leather shoes is going to have tremendous search volume around it, but I'm not going to be able to compete in that space. So men's, leather wingtips in wide sizes, something like that, again, is going to have lower search volume. But it's understanding those search queries, and I would focus mostly initially on on-page optimization. So making sure that your page titles and your meta tag descriptions are forming a cohesive marketing message so that whenever those are coming back in Google, that we're getting a larger percentage of people to click on those, which obviously brings you not just more traffic, it's sending signals to Google that this site has value because a lot of people are clicking on it. And so that, and then the core vitals, that's really important. So making sure that the site is running as lean and mean and fast as possible without taking away from some of the features that you may be offering to your client. There may be certain tools embedded into the site that may slow it down, so then you're in a situation where you have to make that call, and I would err towards keeping the tool rather than nixing it just for speed's sake, if that makes sense. Sure.
Think I got it. It seems like Google's becoming a bit of a problem itself when you search, because when you search now, I'm looking for something and I'm trying to, let's just say I'm looking for MapQuest, and I have to go so far down to get through all the ads. It used to be that they had a thing where I'm feeling lucky and you'd end up where you wanted to. They don't seem to offer that anymore. But is there a way to circumvent all the ads that'll appear before what you're looking for?
You can use some ad blocker technology that will help with that. I will tell you that the recent rollout, that Google's constantly experimenting with that results page and the mix of organic versus paid. It used to be that paid was primarily at the top, and then they started sandwiching it at the bottom too, as an experiment. My guess is that could go away. So they're constantly playing around with this. There is ways to block ads, but I think that Google naturally is going to want to have a mix of both a paid product and an organic product. And those ads that are populating the bottom and sandwiching the organic results in the middle, I think you'll start to see fade away soon. That's a pretty recent development as far as ads both running top and bottom in the results page. But they're at the end of the day an advertising company. People, I think, they look at Google as a tech company and a search engine, which of course they are, but at their core, they are an advertising company.
It's almost as cumbersome as trying to get through the yellow pages,
Yeah.
So it feels like we're going backwards in terms of getting information really quick. One other point or question I have is on the back end. So you get people to your website through search engine optimization. Any great tools for capturing the data on who's actually, not the bounces per se, but the ones that are staying there and clicking more than once, good ways of mining that information?
There are tools that do that. The name off the top of my head escapes me, but I will tell you got to tread lightly there, because if your customers understand that their information is being crawled in that way and sent over, it can cause some trust issues. You can find out who this person is, as in it's a male 35 to 40, but there are tools that will get you down to who this person is and where they are geographically, which I would question if that strategically, as far as building relationships with your customers, if they were ever to catch wind of that, it could be problematic. I had a large industrial client that was doing that. They were getting data of people actively on their site, both their name and email address. It was pulling back, and there was some blowback from that. So I can make some recommendations on some tools, at least provide some, obviously analytics provides some of this demographic information, but in real time, like who's interacting on your site, where are they from, who is this person, there are some tools that do that.
Yeah, and help me, because I could always use some ethical guidance, but on that front, we'd find out, let's just say it was Juice was looking to potentially locate in Beaufort County, and somebody was hitting our site every day, we'd probably want to know that and just kind of cold call or something like that. Do you think that presents trust issues?
Let me think about that a little bit more. I can tell you there's a reason that Google doesn't provide that data in analytics. It's obviously for them a privacy issue, but there is tech again, and this has been since 2016 16 since I was looking at this kind of technology and evaluating it in a real kind of live fire environment. So I don't even know if they exist anymore, because I think that they were walking the line of some of these privacy concerns that you've seen really take hold over the last couple of years. And I don't even know if legally they can operate anymore. But there may be some, I may be wrong about that. There could be tools that are legit that can provide that kind of information, but you got to think about it, at least from Google's point of view, how problematic they would view that.
I think we'd have to be careful with it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course, sure.
Hey, thanks for the presentation. So, if you were running like a website and you had your primary marketing site at, like marketing.com for your company, and then you had like products or other services, is there any advantage to like structuring that at a separate like website domain, or listed as like a subdomain like under your main website?
Subdomains are okay. Subdirectories.
Mm-hmm.
So subdirectories make sense. Google has a really easy time crawling and making sense out of that. Where you start to run into issues is with subdomains or different domains, because what you're starting to do is split that domain authority off. Starts to get split amongst different sites. So, a lot of times you'll see people embed a blog into their site, and it'll be blog.abc.com. You want to have abc.com/blog in that directory structure, so that everything is still living off that top level domain. Yep.
Hey, also thank you for the presentation.
Sure.
Speaking for those of us who are coming from a pretty new, starting from scratch on this stuff, I've kind of got a couple parted question. At what point would you say it makes more sense to build something yourself, or to hire someone to do a site for you if you are starting from scratch? How much would you anticipate a basic website? How much should that cost? Like, seems like $2,000 is the general, from what, 10 years ago when I had somebody build a site for the business that I was running then, that's what that cost. I would, prefer to see if I could do it myself. However, I'm not opposed to purchasing. And then if I was going to do it myself, what's your take on some of the, Wix and Squarespace versus taking a little time to actually learn how to do some basic building on your own? What are the benefits?
So I think the benefits of doing it on your own, assuming that you have those kind of capabilities, is turnaround time. You can likely get done a lot faster than you could working with a provider or an agency. I think the website builders like Squarespace and Wix, for a very entry-level kind of website, like you're just trying to get your foothold in the space, I think they make sense. They're literally drag and drop builders, so they're super easy to work with. That was the whole intent behind them, was to kind of remove designers out of the equation. As you need more tools and features and functionality, I'm a big proponent of WordPress. The risk with WordPress is security issues, but that can be addressed by not having your password as password123. You need to let a very complex alphanumeric password be generated, because that is the vulnerability around WordPress. The upside to WordPress is that you have free themes that you can pull and work from as a base, but it's going to take more probably coding knowledge than, well, it's definitely going to take more coding knowledge than like a Squarespace or a Wix. But there's certain tools and features, whether it's a form tool, if you need to have that embedded into your website, both platforms will be equipped to handle that. So those would be my recommendations if you're kind of easing into the space and using one of the builders. Squarespace would probably be my preference. I think they've built out some really slick features that you can add on. And then as the functionality of the website starts to really expand and the needs of tools that you may have, looking at something like WordPress, if it's e-commerce, WooCommerce is WordPress's companion kind of e-commerce solution. It's a great one up to a point. So if you get up to like 10,000 SKUs, WooCommerce is a good solution. Anything beyond that, it starts to struggle. And then I would look to like a Shopify type platform. I'm a big fan of Shopify. They have their enterprise product called Shopify Plus, and then they compete with companies like Magento and BigCommerce that are building massive e-commerce sites. Does that help?
Is there a difference? Does SEO favor WordPress over Squarespace or vice versa? Is that something that is a thing, or is it not?
That's a really good question. So you could have made the argument 5 years ago that Google was favoring WordPress sites. It's because their code base tends to be a lot cleaner than a custom build, where after many pans being in a website over many years, the code base starts to look like spaghetti. And WordPress is really good at managing that. So I think that, I think that there's a couple of good alternatives, but I think that Squarespace, and they have tools that are really click and drag tools that if you need like an SEO widget, it's right there within Squarespace. And I think that it's a good alternative.
So just based on a little bit of experience I have with Shopify versus WordPress, Shopify has their stuff locked down where you can't really compress their site files if you're trying to do page speed optimization for those key vitals that Ryan was talking about. So it's very much easier from a page speed optimization to improve the images, load time, site files on a WordPress site versus a Shopify site. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Yep, very true. Thank you. And yeah, just earlier I was saying that WooCommerce is a good e-commerce solution to a point, and then you have to start looking at more mid-market to enterprise solutions. And I think that Shopify Plus is my preferred solution right now. I had a large e-commerce client in 2018. They were actually a Shark Tank company called Red Dress Boutique. It was a husband and wife that were running this company, and their e-commerce side of their site was run on Magento, and it was a bogged down, slow mess. And so we made a decision with them to migrate to Shopify Plus from Magento. And with just through that migration, we didn't do anything else. Just through that migration, their SEO results went through the roof because Google said, wait, the site is much faster. It's moving along at a good clip. And it's, again, a resource allocation issue for them.
Where can anyone get in touch with you if they want to learn more or need some assistance with search engine optimization and prefer to hire an agency?
Yeah, so ryanjones32@gmail.com is my personal email address. I will also put my work email address, but this one is probably the best one to contact me. But here is my juice address as well, which is ryan.jones@thinkjuice.com. Oops. And then, of course, you can always Google juice, and somebody there will be able to track me down, depending on the day. We are a fully remote team. We have virtual offices in New York and Miami, but our team of about 50 is distributed across the country. So we work remotely, but people generally know where to find me. My handwriting's so bad. I think everybody knows this means .com.
Well, we're right at 1 o'clock, so we're going to hop off the Facebook Live. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course.
And, let's give Ryan a round of applause.
Thank you, everyone.